Today, we will hear from Mark Chaves. Mark is a professor at Duke University, specializing in the sociology of religion. He serves as the director of the National Congregation Study, which he has previously presented on here at the Common Table. And he serves as the director of the National Survey of Religious Leaders, which we will hear about today. Mark is joined by postdoctoral associate Anna Hollaman, and we just learned that Anna also has just accepted a tenure-track position at Appalachian State. So congratulations to Anna. So to get things started, I'll just say welcome once again, and we look forward to your presentation.
So I'll just jump right in because our time's limited. I'm going to be talking about the National Survey of Religious Leaders. Okay, so there we go. Start with just a few basic facts. The National Survey of Religious Leaders is a survey of a nationally representative sample of clergy who serve congregations. They are the clergy who serve the congregations that participated in Wave 4 of the National Congregation Study, which is another study that I do, a survey of congregations rather than clergy. These data were collected in 2019 and 20. And there's a total of 1,600 leaders in the sample. This includes both primary leaders, head clergy, sole clergy, but it also includes assistants, associates, various kinds of other kinds of clergy. Today, everything we show you today is going to be based on the primary leaders only, and there's 890 of those. This survey was funded by the John Templeton Foundation, so we always have to say thank you very much to them. And there's a website. That website's going to go by fast, but if you Google National Survey of Religious Leaders, you'll find it easily enough. The NSRL asks questions on a lot of different subjects. Today we're going to focus on 5 areas. One is some basics about clergy demographics. Some basics about all of this is going to be basic, actually, about their features of their jobs and occupations. We ask questions about their mental and physical health. We ask some questions about the challenges that they face in ministry, and also about their political attitudes and practices as clergy. Much more, but these are the areas we're going to focus on today. And I'm going to start with the clergy demographics, and then Anna and occupational features. And let me mention, Jack Carroll did a national survey of clergy in 2001. That was really the last time there was a big national survey across the religious spectrum that was nationally representative. I mention it here because we'll show you some change over the last 20 years. Because if we have asked some of the same questions they did, we can compare. So whenever you see change over the last 20 years, the data point from 20 years ago is from Jack's earlier survey. We asked way more subjects than Jack did, so we don't have a comparison with everything, but we do on some. Okay, so starting with clergy demographics, some basic facts. Clergy are getting older. I think this probably won't surprise people in this group. A lot of this, by the way, that we take today, I think won't be surprising, but I hope some of it is. Some of it is. I hope some of it is. In the last 20 years, in 2001, 13% of this is primary clergy, head clergy, were under 40 years old. Today, that's 8%, only 8%. Maybe more strikingly, in 2001, 23% of clergy were over 60 years old. That's more than double to 48% of clergy today. People in the pews are getting older as well because of cohort differences in religious participation, but the clergy are aging, all of this, there's going to be way more to say about, so I'm going to resist the temptation to going into more depth. We can do that in discussion groups, I guess. So, but we're going to put a lot of things on the table. The clergy are getting more ethnically diverse. They're less white, from 80% 81% 20 years ago to 65% today. They're more likely to be born abroad, meaning outside the United States, from 5% in 2001 to 12% today. This shift is almost entirely among Catholic priests. It's a little bit among Protestants, and but it's almost entirely among Catholic priests. With the priesthood has become much more ethnically diverse over this period of time. And then the clergy are more female. 11% of all clergy or head clergy were female in 2001. That's 17% now. People are sometimes surprised that that's so low of a number, but that of course includes all the religious groups, some of which of course don't have women clergy. So this also of course is heavily concentrated in the mainline predominantly white Protestants, not entirely, but mainly where this number is more like 30%. So on all these things, not so much the aging actually, but on both the ethnicity and the gender composition, there's of course big differences across religious groups. When we look at certain occupational features, people are often surprised. I was surprised when I first saw this. At the general story is stability. About 90% of clergy, both 20 years and today, are paid. About a third are bivocational. Again, that number in particular, people are surprised that hasn't gone up in 20 years, but it seems like it hasn't. About 2/3 are second career. People are surprised that hasn't gone up, but it hasn't in 20 years. One thing that has gone up, but maybe not as much as people sometimes think it does, is servant clergy. This is again primary clergy who are serving multiple congregations, which has gone from 12% to 19% in the last 20 years. So, I'll be interested. I can say more about why I think that stability is happening, even if it's surprising, but I think that's an interesting fact about things not changing as much as sometimes it seems like they are. And that's what I'm going to share on basics of demographics. And now I'm going to turn over to Anna, who has done the direct research about clergy health using these data. And so, Anna, go ahead and take it away.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so like Mark mentioned, one topic that we were really interested in when we began to analyze the NSRL data was the subject of clergy health. I want to start by reading this quote from Jack Carroll, who Mark mentioned. When he investigated clergy health 20 years ago from a nationally representative perspective, he found that clergy health fares not very well, though not much worse than the US population as a whole. However, as many of you know, in more recent years, the storyline around clergy health has changed significantly. Over the last 20 years, it's now common for scholars to assert that clergy health has reached crisis levels, with high levels of physical and mental health issues among clergy. And this claim has gotten so common that one author went as far as stating that pastoral work may be dangerous because of the threat to pastors' well-being. So the question that we're faced with when reading Carroll's work from 20 years ago in concert with the more recent work is, did clergy health get significantly worse over these 20 years, or did the way we are researching clergy health change? So I'm going to walk through some basic findings, like Mark said, just very brief overview, but this information in more detail is documented in this paper that I published with David Eagle in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion. But getting into the results, so using the NSRL data, we found that 40% of head clergy, this is all head clergy, 4% of head clergy rated their health as poor or fair overall, as opposed to good or very good or excellent. 42% of clergy reported heights and weights that qualified them as experiencing obesity, and 4% of clergy reported experiencing elevated symptoms of depression. Of course, in order to understand what these numbers mean, we need to compare them to the greater US population, which will allow us to assess if clergy actually are faring exceptionally poorly health-wise. So on the screen now are the results from the 2 nationally representative studies of the US population alongside our sample of clergy. So what we see is that clergy are comparable to the general population on all 3 of these health domains. Clergy may be slightly better off in terms of self-rated health, potentially slightly more likely to be obese, but these differences are not statistically significant. And so here, we did not find any basis for the claim that there is a crisis in clergy health. However, there are important denominational differences that we'll highlight. I'll use depression levels just as one example to show this. So on the screen is the rate of elevated depressive symptoms. We just showed this. This is just sort of zooming in among the US population, among all head clergy and the US population, excuse me, and these again are about equal. However, when we look at the differences among depressive symptoms by religious tradition, what we find is that mainline Protestants clearly stand out as having significantly higher depression levels compared to the other major religious traditions. So if you look just at mainline clergy, you would think that there is a crisis in clergy mental health, as their depression levels are about twice that of the general population. And when we looked at the past research that had been done on clergy mental health since 2001, so since Jack Carroll published his work, almost 2/3 of all published research concerning clergy mental health had been done solely on samples of mainline clergy. So in other words, the way research had been conducted on clergy health, we think has overemphasized the religious tradition doing the worst. So I'll conclude with 2 thoughts. First, to answer our original question, we didn't find evidence of the crisis in clergy health at a national level. This is not to undermine the difficulties that some pastors experience with their health, but again, this was not the case at a national level. However, we found that research on clergy health has increasingly focused solely on samples of mainline Protestant clergy who seem to differ systematically. And second, at the same time, we think there should be more work to understand why there are such significant health differences between traditions in order to understand why some clergy thrive and others struggle to maintain their wellness in their profession.
You prepare to go into your breakout groups, consider the following question that will guide your time together. Here's the question. What, if anything, surprised you in the survey results from clergy that you have heard from clergy that you've heard so far? What, if anything, surprised you in the survey results from clergy that you've heard so far?
Okay, let me go on to the next subject will be clergy political attitudes and practices. We asked a fair number of questions about what clergy do politically. People who study religion and politics, and clergy politics in particular, often distinguish between 2 kinds of clergy activism: direct action, participating in protests, marches, lobbying elected officials, organizing voter registration and such like, versus cue giving, which is taking stands or just saying things that give cues about what a clergy person's political agenda may or may not be, and what they think their people should or shouldn't do. So we asked questions about both kinds of clergy political activity. By far, cue giving kinds of activities are by far more common among clergy than any kind of direct action. So almost maybe a little strong, 85% of clergy say they have publicly urged their people to vote. 70% say they took a public stand on an issue. 66% said they publicly prayed about an issue. So the majority of clergy in the United States, and this is something that it's hard to do trends over time to know whether this clergy have become more politically active than in the past. But today, a majority of clergy are giving cues about their political preferences. Smaller percentages, but not trivial percentages are urging people to be active, so kind of going beyond cue giving, are participating in lobbying. 30% are lobbying elected officials. 30% say that they've organized a group in their congregation to and focused on politics, to engage in politics somehow. 23% say they've participated in a protest or march. And this is the question, by the way, is in your capacity as leader of your congregation, have you participated in a protest? So it's not just, as an individual in their, because of course clergy, almost anything they do is public, but we did ask them to think about in their capacity as 9%. Some people sometimes find this surprising, say that they have publicly endorsed a candidate for office. Of course, that's the thing that clergy are not supposed to do, putting their congregation's tax status at risk. People are sometimes surprised that it's that high. Now, of course, that's the percent to say outright, yes, I endorsed. But when we keep in mind all the cue giving possibilities, that in essence, it's probably higher than that. It's almost certainly higher than that. Kind of interestingly, 23% either have endorsed or say they would endorse if it wouldn't put their tax status at risk. So still a minority. That was relevant a few years ago, and there was talk about changing the tax rules so that it wouldn't be against the rules for clergy to officially endorse. And there was a talk of that unleashing all kinds of clergy activism. But it would unleash some, and it would be it'd still be a minority. That difference between this 9% and this is almost entirely on the liberal side. Black churches and Black clergy and clergy in predominantly white mainline denominations, those are the ones that are saying, yes, I would, if more than conservative or evangelical clergy. So that's a lot, some basics on the extent to which clergy are engaging in various kinds of political activity. We also, when they said they engaged in these kinds of activities, we asked what issues did you work on? What issues were you pursuing? And here, as you might expect, this is kind of busy, but here there's big differences across religious groups in the issues. So political activity, especially cue giving, is very common across the board, but the issues on which people are focused are quite variable. So so that's why it's kind of necessary on this to show you the variation across religious groups, because it's so substantial. So here you can see that on the issue, I meant to focus here. It's on the issue of abortion. It's conservative evangelicals and Catholic priests who are, by far more likely to be, when they're engaged, focused on abortion. It's Black churches, Black clergy who are by far most commonly who are engaged in the issue of police community relations. All these data were collected, by the way, before the summer of 2020. So this is not just a response to events of summer 2020. Mainline and Catholic clergy are most likely the ones involved in hunger poverty issues, also in immigration issues. So we could go through every single issue. I'm not going to do that. It'll be a little too tedious. But the point being that clergy are generally politically involved in non-trivial numbers, but when they're involved they're focused on very, very different issues. A second thing that I want to share about clergy politics is the question of the extent to which clergy are aligned politically with their people. This has been kind of a long-standing subject of attention among people who study religion and politics. Joseph Rosso, who's another postdoc here at Duke, and I have published this paper on this subject, so you can look at it in more detail if you're interested. But basically, the National Survey of Religious Leaders asked clergy, tell us, thinking about how your politics and your people's. Are you more conservative? Much more conservative than your people? Are you more conservative than your people? Are you about the same? Are you more liberal, or are you much more liberal than your people? And there's some really, I think, interesting stuff here. First, evangelicals and Black Protestants are very well aligned with their people politically, much more so than Catholic priests or mainline Protestants. About 3/4 of both evangelical clergy and Black Protestant clergy are say they're about the same politically as their people, with about equal split saying more conservative or more liberal. Half of Catholic clergy, half of mainline clergy say they're more liberal than their people, and a fifth of mainline clergy, which really stands out compared to everybody else, says that they're much more liberal than their people. So the mainline clergy, Catholics and mainline, are different from evangelical and Black Protestants in their degree of alignment, but the mainline really stand out. And this shows up in lots of ways in qualitative research of mainline clergy struggling with being much more liberal in their clergy and how to minister in those kinds of situations. This has been true, by the way, this kind of higher degree of mismatch in the mainline for 50 years. People have noticed this since the 1960s, when there first started to be really systematic research about clergy politics in connection with the civil rights movement. So that I find that really interesting. It's not new, but it's an ongoing issue in the mainline. Another thing I'll point out here is that some of you may recall that there was a fair amount of mass media attention about after the Trump was elected, about evangelical clergy who were getting kicked out of their churches because they were not as pro-Trump as their people were, and their people didn't like that. And they kind of left the impression that that was something typical among evangelicals and more conservative Protestants, but it's not typical. What these data show is that those stories, obviously they exist, but it's a minority. It's the exception rather than the rule. And this shows up also, by the way, in the larger paper. We can compare actual voting, who people voted for, and the same kind of thing shows up, that the evangelical conservative clergy are as politically conservative and as pro-Trump as their people are. So we shouldn't get the impression that these media reports were typical situation. Okay, the last thing I'm going to present is we asked clergy in an open-ended way to tell us what are the most important practical challenges you currently face in your work in your congregation. These are just an open-ended question at the end of the survey, so people could say anything they wanted, and then we categorized responses into various kinds of categories. That's the question that I just said. These were the categories that turned up in a noticeable way that we categorized responses into. By far, the most common challenge mentioned by clergy was something to do with the declining commitment to religion and congregation in both their congregations and in the culture at large, and the challenges associated with ministering in a secular culture, basically. And this showed up there were two different versions of this. One was people talking about declining commitment to religion in the culture at large. So these are quotes from the responses. Communicating timeless truth in a culture that's almost post-truth and sees truth, something that is inevitably relative and changing, or living grace in a culture increasingly hostile to faith. These were kind of typical kinds of responses. But people also talked about the challenges of commitment that wasn't what they wished it was in their churches, among the people in their churches. So It's easy to get discouraged over the lack of regular church attendance, and of those who do attend, the lack of involvement or commitment in church-related activities. I yearn for greater spiritual development among my people. I've been trained to foster it, yet my training is not sufficient where the motivation for it is lacking. So, I think it's pretty striking that half of all the clergy who responded to this question about challenges said something along those lines of one of those two sorts. After that, the percentages who mention any specific thing get much lower. The next highest is finances, congregational finances, 10% facilities. So, a non-trivial number mentioned something pretty, pragmatic about the facilities or finances. A noticeable amount said something about generational change or generational differences in religion. This also took two forms, the generational change. One is just talking about engaging young people. Our biggest challenge is engaging young people between the age of confirmation and their 40s. Our church is aging. It's the same boat so many mainline churches are in. But another version focused on connecting people across generations and across ages. We have no one older and mature in their faith pouring into younger families. I'm trying to connect generations rather than the age and stage silos that exacerbate the issues of younger generations leaving the church. So those are different versions of mentioning something to do with generation and age differences. After that, percentages got low, but only 5% mentioned anything about navigating race. Kind of in general, it's sort of interesting how low the percentages are for kind of big public, social, political, cultural issues. Only 5% mentioned racial issues. Less than 1% said anything about LGBTQ issues. Of course, that's maybe particularly surprising given how much attention that's gotten in the United Methodist Church lately, for example. 1% said something about technology, 2% said something about leadership transitions, 3% said something about dealing with their denomination or their denominational leaders. Maybe in addition to this big, large percentage that talked about declining commitment in the culture, maybe the main takeaway here is that local, internal, practical issues turned up more often cited by clergy than kind of cultural, social, political issues when asked what they're. Now the question did say, what are your practical challenges? So maybe we push clergy in that way. Might also mention that most of these data were collected before COVID hit, but some of it was collected after COVID hit, after March 2020. And once COVID hit, 25% of the people who responded to this question said something about managing COVID. But that's not surprising, and so I didn't put on the graph, but that is there as well. And that's what I've prepared to share. Obviously, we could go into way more depth of all this stuff, but we thought it would be good to give you an overview of some of these subjects.
Just to start it off, I'll go back to the very first question that was posted regarding the political ideology stats that you posted there, the data. The question is, he wonders if there would be a significant difference if the data were parsed out by age. For example, seems to be a trend to more conservatism among younger Catholic clergy than older. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, we did look at that, and there are not big differences by age. The differences across religious groups really swamp other kinds of differences. Yeah, maybe that's surprising.
Yeah. Another question, if the
Or
political.
I'm sorry, let me add one other thing. It's
Sure.
also maybe surprising that it's still half of Catholic, because that is a real trend that the person mentioned about more younger Catholic priests being more conservative than older Catholic priests. So maybe in that context, it's also surprising that half of Catholic priests said they were still more liberal than their people, even in the face of that trend that you mentioned.
Okay, thank you. Another question, if the political and perhaps even theological alignments of the mainline Protestant and Roman Catholic clergy, if they are mismatched with their congregations, what might account for the fact that Roman Catholic clergy are faring better than their mainline peers, for example, in the health data that Anna presented?
Yeah, that was an obvious question that occurred to us too, is this mismatch part of the story? Does it create mental health and other kinds of issues? And the truth is, we can't find a correlation in these data between the mismatch and the various health, mental and physical health outcomes. So it seems like it ought to be, and maybe it's issues of limits of our measures and so on. But we've looked at that, and it's not in these data. That so if you just look at the main line and compare the ones who are mismatched to the ones who aren't, you don't see the health differences across them, for example. So. It seems so plausible that I wouldn't want to come out and strongly and say no, absolutely not. But we don't see it in these data.
Okay, great, thank you. Andrew Oswald has a comment that purely anecdotal, but his experience with foreign-born Catholic priests in the U.S. is that they're quite joyful and unflappable. And if so, that would perhaps correlate with the increase in foreign-born clergy in the U.S. Catholic Church.
Maybe, and also, by the way, we didn't show you this, but Catholic priests have much lower obesity rates than Protestants, and that we think is because of the higher percentage of foreign-born. That does show up that the foreign-born priests are less likely to be overweight than American-born. So I just throw that out there as another correlation that is there.
Okay. Another question. Do you know if the educational background of clergy has changed over the years, more recently?
Yeah. Not. I believe, I hesitated just because I don't have the numbers at my fingertips. If anything, clergy are more educated than they were in the past. I don't know how much, though. I think the overall rates, say, of clergy with MDiv degrees, say, are not much different than they were 20 years ago. If you go further back than that, I think there probably is an increase, but I don't think there's a recent. It's not declining, and I don't think there's an increase in the last 20 years in more educated.
Okay, thank you. Regarding the obesity numbers, Paul Kuzma is asking if the numbers were parsed out per denomination, like a breakdown, sort of like the depression numbers were. Did you have any?
Yes. Yes, we just didn't, and we just didn't show them. If you go look at Anna, the paper that Anna showed you, which was, or she showed you the abstract to it, they have those details in there. I mentioned the obesity differences. The main thing that stands out there is Catholics are less obese. There are some other things. I don't think there is anything huge besides that depression difference that we did show you and the obesity difference that I mentioned. But if you track down that paper, it was published in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, that they have a graph in there about that shows the denomination, not specific denominations, but like we showed you here, the kind of major religious groupings by some of the other measures.
Great, thank you. Going back to Candace Surface had a thought that you wanted to share about their breakout group after the health data was presented, discussed the self-reporting component. And they believe that clergy, particularly more traditional faith backgrounds, are perhaps underreporting specific mental health struggles, whereas perhaps the mainline Protestants are more willing to discuss it? And any
That's a
just
question
possibilities?
worth pondering and asking. I don't know myself. And by the way, I should say Anna is the expert on the health parts of the data, and she had to leave because she has to teach a class.
Oh, okay.
She might be able to. I know they've thought about that because there's also differences. You notice that they, when we compare it to the national surveys, it does make a difference how you ask these questions and whether it's self-reported or based on other kinds of ways of measuring it. So I know it does matter, but I don't know if there's differences either, if there's established differences in self-reporting across religious groups. But it would be worth investigating, I think.
Sure. Thank you. Another question was, and I'll just sort of try to summarize this question. Do you know if there are any differences between your study and other more recent studies, say with the Barna Research Group, which they did in 21 and 22? I'm not sure the specifics on that, of course. And the more recent survey done by Hartford in the fall of 23, anything that you might be aware of there? Any differences?
The one thing from the Barna was that I believe that they showed rates of job satisfaction that are considerably lower than what we see. That's the one, I have to say our survey is truly nationally representative, with a pretty high response rate and it's very easy to assess characteristics of our sample. That is not always true with Barna samples. So sometimes it's hard to make direct comparisons because you don't always know what the sample exactly was and what the response rate exactly was, and how to think about that. Kind of maybe surprisingly, there's maybe not more differences than you might expect given those, but I do think that if I remember correctly, they got a lower. They made clergy look less satisfied with their jobs and careers and ministries than I think they are. I remember that being and that we see in our data. Clergy in general, this has been true in other surveys as well. Clergy report among the highest of any occupation, actually, report the highest levels of job satisfaction, career satisfaction. So this is another version, kind of like Anna's point about clergy health, is that we shouldn't overstate clergy distress in their occupational roles. And I felt like the Barna, at least the media reports, I did look at their report. I thought that's the one thing I remember is I thought that was possibly misleading. Now, having said that, I don't want to, we're recording this. I don't really want to be so negative. They asked the question slightly differently than we did, and so it could be that the differences were how the questions were asked. So anyway, that's the one thing that I remember. I haven't looked at the most recent Hartford. No, they're surveying. Are they surveying clergy too? They're surveying congregations. I know. So anyway, I don't know. I haven't looked at the most recent.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thad posted that he'll be happy to send out some of the information that Mark has been referencing.
Also, can I say, Thad, maybe this is what you mean, those articles that they might be behind paywalls, like if you try to get to the journal, but Thad, I'd be happy to just send you PDFs of the articles, or maybe if you can get them, to share. So
thank you.
So we can get, if you're interested, we can get you the article.
Yeah. Another question, Deanna Harrison has a question, wanting to know if there's any kind of correlation between church size, church attendance, like say lower church attendance, and those ministers who are being more politically vocal from the pulpit.
Yeah, no, there wasn't. We looked at that, and there's really there really isn't. No. Well,
okay.
Yeah, no, the short answer is no. We couldn't find big differences in clergy political activity based on congregation size.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question is, having collected this data, what would you feel is the greatest contributor, if any, to the verbal and oftentimes physical rise in violence that we're seeing in national reports? I don't know if can you comment on?
Violence about clergy? I'm not totally
I'm not
following the
sure.
question.
Reverend Ribbons, if you would like to, let's see. Hate-fueled violence, hate-fueled violence. So, do you have any thoughts about the greatest contributor toward the rise in hate-filled violence? I don't know if there's any.
I don't think there's, I like to stay close to my data in moments like this, and we didn't ask anything in the survey that I think would speak to that.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, no, that's all right. Thank you. Another question Thad's posting. With the election coming up and political tensions obviously rising in many ways, do the data suggest any practices that may be helpful or unhelpful for clergy and their overall well-being?
That question had several parts. As I mentioned before, we didn't. I don't think we can find a correlation between the political activities and clergy well-being. That part. In terms of helpful or unhelpful, yeah, I'm not. I guess what the person means is helpful. Make things less tense. Can clergy do things to make things less tense? I mean, there's some common sense things one might say here, but I'm not sure there's anything in the data that would give me particular insight into that. Maybe to say that. The thing about the alignment is that even one thing that being better aligned with your clergy, with your people does is make you better able to mobilize them. I'm not sure really, to be honest, how much clergy are changing people's minds politically. But when they are in alignment, they're probably better able to mobilize politically. And I think that maybe that puts a certain kind of responsibility more on the shoulders of the clergy, who are more in a position to mobilize if they want to, for better or worse. So that's maybe just one observation.
Okay, thank you. I had a question myself just on the aging clergy, the trend toward clergy getting older. Do you know why that is? Are there fewer people entering ministry today? Is that the reason?
Yes, that's the fundamental reason. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, we know this from other sources. The average age of people in seminaries is, in their 30s now instead of, 20s. And we can see there's been surveys of college freshmen for 50 years or something now, and where they ask them, what do you want to be when you grow up? And the percentage who say, minister, priest, religious leader, has been declining for a long time. Anybody associated with a seminary knows this. The 22-year, there's just a way smaller percentage of 22-year-old college graduates who want to go to divinity school and be a clergy person. So yes, that's the fundamental answer to that.
We have time for one more question, Thad.
Let me just throw in. I wish
sure.
I could say it was because clergy are actually so healthy; they live so much longer than everybody else. That explains but I don't think that's. In fact, I know that's not what.
Yeah, another question that I had was on the female clergy. I think it was 17% or something like that. As I remember wondering, we were wondering if speculating about why that number might not be higher, or some of us might have thought it might have been higher by now. Do you know if there are more female clergy in those particular denominations that do ordain women? Because I think you had other ones lumped in there from others that don't.
Right, that's right. That's why it's so low, is because it's mainly the white mainline, of course, where the female clergy are in higher numbers. But there are a smallish percentage of the overall religious scene. So yes, I think the percentages are high, have been increasing among the white mainline, but not as fast as you might think. We know this from seminary data that I believe that the percent of students in MDiv programs in seminaries kind of plateaued at 30-ish%. I don't know, a decade ago. I'm not going to come up with the exact date, but there's this huge increase in women going to seminary and then, of course, becoming clergy starting in the 70s, and it went up and up and up, but it hit 30% and maybe even longer than a decade ago. Maybe somebody here can date that. I should have that year in my mind, but if you look at ATS data, Association of Theological Schools, they publish these data, and so you can see. So we seem to have hit a plateau in the feminization of the mainline clergy. Now, of course, that's hugely cohort specific. So, the more time goes on, the oldest cohorts are still overwhelmingly male, oldest cohorts of clergy. So, as they leave the scene, the overall percent of female clergy in the mainline will continue to go up. But I'm not sure it'll go up to 50% again, because the percent of women in seminaries and MDiv programs has kind of plateaued. So anyway, there's some interesting subtleties to, it's obviously the case that there's more women in but there's some interesting subtleties